There is a particular kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with a crisis or a dramatic collapse. It settles in quietly, like dust accumulating on a shelf. You've stopped noticing. You wake up one morning not necessarily unhappy, not necessarily in pain, and you realize that the version of yourself you imagined you'd become by now simply hasn't shown up. The ambitions you carried at 22 feel like photographs of someone else's life. The changes you promised yourself, the discipline, the clarity, the courage remain perpetually scheduled for next Monday, next month, next year. And what's strange is that you're not lazy. You know, you're not lazy. You think about changing constantly. You read about it. You watch videos about it. You have genuine moments of clarity where you see exactly what needs to happen and feel briefly, powerfully convinced that this time will be different. And then something happens, or more accurately, nothing happens, and you find yourself back in the same patterns, the same avoidances, the same quiet frustrations. So the question worth sitting with isn't why you haven't changed yet. The question is why most human beings across all of history, across all cultures, with all the intelligence and self-awareness they possess, find it almost impossibly difficult to become genuinely different people. Because this isn't a personal failure, this is one of the deepest puzzles in all of psychology. And understanding it, really understanding it, not just collecting motivational phrases about it, might be the most important intellectual project of your life. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Most people who say they want to change don't actually want to change. What they want is the outcome of change without the process of change. They want the confidence without the repeated confrontations with fear. They want the strong body without the discipline of consistent effort. They want the meaningful relationship without the vulnerability and the difficult conversations. They want the career that matters without the years of uncertain, unglamorous work that precedes it. And this isn't a moral failing, it's a deeply human tendency. But until you see it clearly in yourself, you will keep mistaking the desire for the act, and you will keep wondering why nothing shifts. Think about the architecture of a building for a moment. When you look at a finished structure, something elegant, something that stands, you see the result. You don't see the foundation. You don't see the months of unglamorous excavation, the pouring of concrete into holes in the ground that nobody photographs, the careful boring work of ensuring that what sits beneath is solid enough to support. Everything above. Most people want to build the visible floors. They have very little interest in the foundation. And so they construct impressive-looking things on unstable ground, and then they're genuinely puzzled when those things collapse. Change works the same way. The visible part, the behavior, the habit, the new identity is supported by something underneath that most people never address, and that something is their relationship with truth. Here's what I mean by that. Every person carries within them a story about who they are. This story isn't neutral. It's not an objective account. It's a carefully curated narrative that protects certain beliefs about the self, that justifies certain behaviors, that explains certain failures in ways that preserve the image you have of yourself. And this story is incredibly powerful, not because it's accurate, often it's deeply inaccurate, but because it's familiar, because it's been reinforced so many times that it feels like reality rather than interpretation. You tell yourself you're someone who isn't good with money, and so you don't examine your spending. You tell yourself you're someone who struggles with relationships, and so you don't examine your patterns of avoidance or control. You tell yourself you're someone who works better under pressure, which is a beautifully sophisticated way of telling yourself that procrastination is a personality trait rather than a habit you could dismantle. The story protects you from the discomfort of genuine self-examination, and genuine self-examination is the only doorway through which real change can pass. This is why information alone never produces transformation. You can know everything about nutrition and still eat badly. You can understand the psychology of procrastination in forensic detail and still procrastinate. You can read every book ever written about meaningful relationships and still sabotage your own. Knowledge without honest self-confrontation is like having a map in a country you refuse to actually enter. It gives you the comfortable illusion of progress without requiring the actual journey. So what separates the rare people who change from the many who don't? It's not intelligence. Intelligent people are often the worst at changing because they're skilled enough to construct elaborate justifications for their avoidance. It's not willpower, because willpower is a resource that depletes and cannot be the primary engine of transformation. It's not even motivation, because motivation is an emotion and emotions are temporary. You cannot build a permanent life on a temporary feeling. What separates the people who genuinely change is something more foundational, and it begins with a specific kind of honesty, the kind that most people spend enormous psychological energy avoiding. It's the capacity to look at yourself clearly and say, this pattern, this behavior, this avoidance, I'm doing this. Not circumstances, not other people, not my childhood, not my genes, not the economy, not my boss. I'm doing this. Now that's not the same as self-blame. Self-blame is actually another form of avoidance. When you collapse into guilt and self-criticism, you're still not looking at the behavior clearly. You're just redirecting your attention toward how terrible you feel about it, which is its own kind of comfort, because feeling bad about something can masquerade as taking it seriously. Real accountability is quieter than that. It's less dramatic. It's the moment when you stop explaining and start observing. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine someone who keeps finding themselves in relationships where they feel unappreciated. This happens repeatedly, different partners, same pattern. The easy interpretation, the comfortable one, is that they keep choosing the wrong people. And there's probably some truth in that. But the deeper question, the one that actually leads somewhere, is what am I doing that contributes to this dynamic? What do I communicate about what I will and won't accept? What signals do I send early on about my own needs? What do I avoid saying because I'm afraid of conflict? And how does that avoidance eventually create the very distance I'm trying to prevent? That kind of questioning is uncomfortable. It requires you to give up the position of innocent victim, which is a position that carries a kind of dignity, the dignity of the wrong party. And people hold on to that dignity fiercely because the alternative seems to be accepting blame. But there's a third option that most people miss entirely: accepting responsibility without accepting blame. Recognizing that you have more agency in your situation than your current story allows, not because the situation is your fault, but because you are the only person in your life you can actually change. The psychological mechanism underneath most failed attempts at change is what we might call the homeostasis of identity. Your nervous system, your social environment, your habits, your thoughts, they all form a kind of ecosystem that has achieved a stable configuration. And that ecosystem resists disruption, even when the disruption would be beneficial. This isn't a metaphor. This is something you can observe directly in your own experience. You decide to start waking up earlier. The first morning, the alarm goes off, and something in you, something that feels almost like a physical force, pushes back. It's not just tiredness, it's something more organized than that. It's the entire system of your life defending its current configuration. The same thing happens when you try to speak up in a situation where you normally stay quiet. Or when you try to set a boundary with someone who's used to you having none. Or when you sit down to do the difficult creative work you've been avoiding for months. There's a force that rises to meet you, and most people interpret that force as a signal that they shouldn't proceed. They treat the resistance as information. They think, I'm not ready yet. I'll do this when it feels easier, when I'm more confident, when conditions are better. But here's what's actually happening. That resistance is not a signal to stop. It's a signal that you've arrived at the edge of your current identity. The discomfort you feel is the friction between who you are now and who you're trying to become. And you cannot get to the other side without passing through it. There is no route around it. The people who change are not the ones who feel less resistance. They feel exactly the same resistance you do. What's different is that they've developed a different relationship with discomfort. They've learned through repeated experience that discomfort is not dangerous, that it passes, that on the other side of it, something real is waiting. This is one of the most important psychological lessons a person can internalize. The feelings that precede meaningful action are almost never pleasant. Courage doesn't feel like strength before you act. It feels like fear. Discipline doesn't feel like power before you begin. It feels like reluctance. Honesty doesn't feel like integrity before you speak. It feels like risk. The emotional experience of doing the right thing, the hard thing, the growth-producing thing, is frequently indistinguishable from the emotional experience of doing something frightening and potentially dangerous. And your nervous system, which evolved to keep you safe, cannot tell the difference. It just sounds the alarm. The rare people who change have learned to act in spite of that alarm. Not by suppressing it. Suppression doesn't work and creates its own problems, but by developing enough perspective to recognize what the alarm actually means. They've built a kind of internal translator that converts this feels dangerous into this is important, and that translation doesn't happen automatically. It has to be practiced. It has to be earned through small, repeated acts of doing the uncomfortable thing anyway and surviving it. Which brings us to something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss change, the role of suffering that you choose versus suffering that happens to you. There's a distinction here that I think is one of the most practically important ideas in all of psychology. When suffering is imposed on you, loss, illness, failure, rejection, it tends to make you smaller. Not always, and not forever. But the initial effect of involuntary suffering is often contraction. You withdraw, you protect, you become more cautious, more defended, more rigid. This is a natural response. It's the organism protecting itself. But there's another kind of suffering, the kind you voluntarily take on, the suffering of the early morning when you could sleep, the suffering of the difficult conversation you could avoid, the suffering of the creative work that might fail, the business you might lose, the relationship you might damage by being honest. When you choose that suffering, when you walk toward it with clear eyes, something very different happens. Instead of contracting, you expand, not immediately, not comfortably. But over time, the person who repeatedly chooses voluntary difficulty becomes someone who is genuinely more capable of handling involuntary difficulty when it arrives, because they've built something inside themselves that wasn't there before. Think of it like physical training. The body doesn't get stronger by avoiding stress. It gets stronger by encountering stress in controlled, deliberate ways, stress that challenges the system without destroying it. The muscles tear slightly and then rebuild stronger. The cardiovascular system is pushed and then recovers with greater capacity. The same principle operates psychologically. The person who never voluntarily confronts difficulty never develops the internal resources to handle difficulty when it arrives uninvited. And difficulty always arrives uninvited eventually. That is one of the very few certainties of human life. So why don't more people embrace this? Why, if voluntary difficulty produces growth and resilience, do most people spend enormous energy engineering a life of maximum comfort and minimum friction? Because comfort is immediately rewarding and growth is delayed. And the human brain, magnificent as it is profoundly biased toward the immediate. This isn't a moral failing. It's architecture. The parts of your brain that evaluate reward and risk were shaped by evolutionary pressures that operated on a time scale of immediate survival. The berry in front of you was more important than the harvest 3 months from now. The threat nearby was more urgent than the opportunity in the distance. And those ancient biases are still operating inside you in a world that has changed beyond recognition. When you choose to scroll your phone instead of working on the project that matters, you're not being weak. You're being human. The phone delivers immediate, reliable, low-cost reward. The project delivers uncertain, delayed, high-cost reward. Your brain knows which one to choose. The question is whether you can override that ancient calculation with something more sophisticated, with your capacity for long-term thinking, for meaning-making, for understanding that who you become is built from the choices you make when the immediate reward is pointing in the wrong direction. And this is where the concept of meaning becomes practically rather than philosophically important, because meaning is one of the few things powerful enough to compete with immediate reward. When what you're doing is connected to something you genuinely care about, something that extends beyond your immediate comfort, the calculus changes. Not easily, not automatically, but genuinely. The person who is building something they believe in can endure difficulties that would stop someone who is simply following instructions or pursuing someone else's definition of success. This is why so many people who achieve conventional markers of success, the income, the title, the house, the recognition, still feel profoundly empty, because they've been optimizing for the wrong target. They've been pursuing things that their culture told them would produce satisfaction, and those things have produced comfort and status, but not meaning. And comfort and status, it turns out, are not the same as a life worth living. The people who change, really change, not just adjust their surface behavior, almost always do so in the context of something they've decided genuinely matters, not something they've been told should matter, something they've arrived at through honest self-examination and genuine reflection, because the energy required to transform a character is enormous. You cannot sustain it on borrowed motivation. You cannot sustain it on someone else's values. It has to be rooted in something you actually believe, something that survives the 3 a.m. moments when everything feels futile and the old patterns are whispering that they're easier and more comfortable and maybe you should just go back. Let me talk about something that I think is almost entirely misunderstood in popular discussions of change, and that's the role of identity. Most approaches to behavioral change focus on habits. Do the thing repeatedly until it becomes automatic. Build systems, create routines, track your progress, and all of that has genuine value. I'm not dismissing it, but it addresses the surface layer of behavior without touching the deeper layer of identity, and the identity layer is where the real action is. Here's what I mean. Your behavior at any given moment is largely an expression of who you believe yourself to be, not who you want to be, who you believe you are right now in your bones. If you believe yourself to be someone who is fundamentally disorganized, you will find ways to be disorganized even when you've installed systems designed to prevent it. If you believe yourself to be someone who is fundamentally unlovable, you will find ways to confirm that belief even in relationships with people who are trying to love you. If you believe yourself to be someone who isn't capable of the level of success you're pursuing, you will find ways, subtle, unconscious, remarkably creative ways to ensure that you don't achieve it. This is what psychologists sometimes call self-concept consistency. The mind has a powerful drive to behave in ways that confirm its existing beliefs about itself, even when those beliefs are negative, even when confirming them causes suffering, because consistency feels safe. Because the known, even when it's painful, is less frightening than the unknown, and a genuinely different version of yourself is, by definition, unknown. So lasting change requires not just behavioral adjustment, but identity revision. You have to update the story you tell about who you are. And this is where most self-improvement efforts fail, because they try to change the behavior without changing the story, and the story keeps pulling the behavior back toward its old configuration like a rubber band, returning to its natural shape. How do you change the story? Not by positive affirmations, not by telling yourself things you don't believe. That approach fails because it creates a conflict between the surface claim and the deeper belief. And the deeper belief almost always wins. The way you change the story is by accumulating evidence. Small, genuine, undeniable evidence that you are, in fact, someone who does the thing you're trying to become. Every time you follow through on something you said you would do, even something small, you deposit a piece of evidence into the file that is your self-concept. Every time you do the hard thing when the easy thing was available, you add another piece. Over time, and this takes longer than most people expect, the file becomes thick enough that the story starts to shift. Not because you declared a new identity, but because you've earned it through repeated action. This is why the starting point for genuine change is almost never the grand gesture. It's not the dramatic announcement, the public commitment, the complete life overhaul. Those things feel powerful because they're emotionally intense, but emotional intensity is not the same as genuine transformation. The starting point is something much smaller and much less exciting, doing one small thing consistently that the person you want to become would do, and then doing it again and again. Not because it feels meaningful yet, it probably won't, not at first, but because you've decided that who you're becoming is more important than how you feel right now. There's a pattern I've observed in people who successfully transform themselves, and it's worth examining carefully because it runs counter to almost everything popular culture tells you about change. These people are not, in general, more optimistic than others. They don't necessarily believe that things will work out. They don't have a special gift for positive thinking. What they have instead is a kind of sober commitment to the process independent of the outcome. They've made a decision, not an emotional declaration, but a genuine decision about the kind of person they want to be. And they pursue that with a consistency that doesn't depend on feeling good about it. This is the difference between inspiration-driven change and values-driven change. Inspiration-driven change surges when you feel motivated and collapses when you don't. It's reactive. It responds to your emotional state. Values-driven change is more like a compass than a weather vane. It points in a consistent direction regardless of which way the wind is blowing. And the people who change are the ones who've shifted from following their feelings to following their values, which is one of the most difficult psychological transitions a person can make, because it requires you to act against your immediate emotional state on a regular basis. Now, let me address something that might be creating friction as you listen to this. You might be thinking, all of this sounds like a prescription for grinding, joyless effort. Like I'm suggesting that the path to genuine change is a life of permanent struggle and self-denial. That's not what I'm saying, and I want to be precise about why. The suffering involved in voluntary growth is not the same as the suffering involved in self-punishment. There's a version of this conversation that leads people toward a kind of brutal self-discipline that is actually another form of self-rejection, a way of treating yourself as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be developed. That approach doesn't produce genuine change. It produces burnout, rigidity, and a brittle kind of performance that collapses under real pressure. The genuine path is more nuanced. It involves taking yourself seriously enough to hold yourself to standards that reflect your actual values. Seriously enough to stop accepting from yourself the excuses you would never accept from someone you respected. But it also involves a fundamental compassion for the difficulty of the process. Not the soft compassion that excuses avoidance, but the real compassion that acknowledges this is genuinely hard. Changing who you are is one of the hardest things a human being can attempt. The difficulty is not evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of the magnitude of what you're trying to do. There's a metaphor I find useful here. Imagine someone learning to navigate in open water. The sea is not hostile to them personally. It's simply indifferent. It operates according to its own principles, and those principles don't bend to accommodate the navigator's preferences or comfort. The navigator who succeeds is not the one who demands calmer water. It's the one who develops genuine skill, who learns to read the conditions, to adjust the course, to work with the reality of the sea rather than against it. And that skill is developed through exposure, through practice, through making mistakes in conditions where mistakes are survivable, and through gradually expanding the range of conditions they can handle. Your life is the open water. The conditions are often not what you'd choose. The question is whether you're developing genuine navigational skill or whether you're still waiting for the sea to become calmer before you venture out. Let me talk about relationships for a moment, because this is where the psychology of change becomes most visible and most challenging. Other people are not just the context in which your change happens. They are active participants in whether it happens at all. The people around you have a relationship with the version of you that currently exists. They've adapted to it. They've built expectations around it. They've developed ways of interacting with you that depend on you remaining recognizable. And when you begin to change, when you start setting limits where you had none, speaking honestly where you were previously silent, pursuing something that matters to you rather than performing the role that was expected, the people around you will often push back. Not necessarily maliciously, often unconsciously, but the push will come. This is one of the most underestimated obstacles to genuine change. You might do everything right internally, develop the clarity, build the habits, shift the identity, and still find yourself pulled back into old patterns by the gravitational field of your existing relationships. Because relationships are systems too, and systems resist change in their components. The person who has always been the agreeable one in their family finds that when they start asserting their own perspective, there's discomfort, confusion, sometimes anger. The person who has always been available for everyone finds that when they start protecting their time and energy, some people experience it as abandonment. The person who has always played it safe finds that when they start taking genuine risks. Some of the people who claim to support them become subtly discouraging. This doesn't mean those people are bad. It means they're human, and humans find change in others unsettling, even when they claim to want it. What it means practically is that genuine change requires a kind of social courage that most discussions of self-improvement completely ignore. It requires the willingness to tolerate the temporary discomfort of being misunderstood or disapproved of by people whose approval you've been accustomed to receiving. It requires the capacity to hold your new direction steady even when the social environment is pulling you back toward the familiar. And this is where the question of integrity becomes practically rather than morally important. Integrity, in the sense of acting in accordance with what you actually believe, rather than what the situation seems to demand, is not just a virtue. It's a structural requirement for genuine change. Because every time you compromise your emerging self to manage someone else's discomfort, you deposit a piece of evidence into the file that says, I don't actually believe in this new direction enough to defend it. And that evidence accumulates just as the positive evidence does, pulling you back toward the old story. I want to address something that often goes unspoken in conversations about why people don't change. And it's this: for many people, their current situation, however painful, however limiting, is actually serving a function they're not consciously aware of. The anxiety that never quite resolves might be keeping you from having to make the decision about what you actually want. The procrastination might be protecting you from the possibility of genuine failure, because if you never fully try, you never have to confront the question of whether you're capable. The relationship that makes you unhappy might be providing a certainty, a known quantity that feels safer than the uncertainty of being alone or of trying again. The victimhood narrative, the story that your situation is entirely the result of forces outside your control, might be protecting you from the weight of genuine responsibility, which is heavy and which comes with the terrifying implication that you are the author of your own life. This is not a comfortable idea, but I think it's one of the most important ideas in psychology. The patterns you most want to escape are often the patterns you're most invested in maintaining at a level below conscious awareness. And until you can see that, until you can honestly ask yourself what your problem might be giving you, what it might be protecting you from you, will keep trying to solve it with solutions that address the surface while leaving the function intact. The rare people who change are almost always people who have at some point become more afraid of staying the same than they are of changing. That's an important asymmetry to understand. Change requires courage because it involves genuine uncertainty. But staying the same also involves a kind of suffering, the slow, grinding suffering of a life that isn't becoming what it could be. The quiet accumulation of regret, the growing gap between who you are and who you sense you could be. And for most people, for most of their lives, the suffering of staying the same is familiar enough to be tolerable, while the uncertainty of change feels unbearable. What shifts that equation? What makes someone finally willing to walk into the uncertainty? Sometimes it's a crisis, a loss, a failure, a health scare, a relationship ending that makes the cost of staying the same suddenly undeniable. The old equilibrium is destroyed, and the person has no choice but to reconstruct. And in that reconstruction, if they do it honestly, they have the opportunity to build something better than what was there before. But crisis is not the only catalyst, and it's not the most reliable one. Because crisis can also produce contraction rather than expansion. People who change through crisis often simply rebuild the same structure in a slightly different location. The real transformation comes not from being forced to change by circumstances, but from choosing to change before circumstances force you, from developing enough awareness and enough honesty to see that the current direction leads somewhere you don't want to go, and deciding to alter course while you still have the freedom to do so. That kind of preemptive, voluntary change is rarer and harder than crisis-driven change, because it requires you to act on a pain that hasn't fully arrived yet. It requires you to take seriously the trajectory of your life rather than just its current position. And most people are not naturally good at trajectory thinking. They're good at position thinking, at assessing how things are right now, but who you will be in 5 years is not determined by where you are now. It's determined by the direction you're moving and the speed at which you're moving in that direction. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you continue exactly as you are, same patterns, same avoidances, same daily choices, same stories about yourself, where does that trajectory lead? Not where do you hope it leads? Where does it actually lead? If you follow the logic of the current direction with honest eyes, that question is uncomfortable for most people because the honest answer is often not where they want to go. But it's also one of the most clarifying questions you can ask yourself, because it makes the cost of inaction visible. And making the cost of inaction visible is one of the things that can shift the equation between the fear of changing and the fear of staying the same. Now, I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this kind of reflection that becomes paralyzing rather than clarifying. You can spend so much time analyzing your patterns, understanding your psychology, examining your trajectory, that the analysis itself becomes another form of avoidance. Insight without action is just sophisticated procrastination. Understanding why you do something does not automatically change the behavior. It just makes you a more articulate version of the same person. At some point, and this point comes earlier than most people want it to, understanding has to give way to doing. Not perfect understanding, not complete clarity, not the certainty that this will work. Just enough understanding to take the next step, and then taking it even in the presence of doubt and fear and the very real possibility of failure. This is the place where most intelligent, self-aware people they confuse the map for the territory. They think that understanding the landscape is the same as traversing it, but the map is not the territory, and knowing the route is not the same as walking it. At some point, you have to put down the map and start moving. And moving means accepting uncertainty, which means accepting the possibility of getting lost, which means accepting that being lost is not the same as being finished. The people who change are not the people who never get lost. They're the people who've developed enough trust in their own capacity to navigate that getting lost doesn't stop them. They've accumulated enough evidence of their own resilience through small, repeated acts of doing difficult things that the uncertainty of the journey doesn't feel fatal. It feels like part of the journey. Let me say something about time, because I think the relationship most people have with time is one of the hidden obstacles to genuine change. Most people dramatically overestimate what they can change in a month and dramatically underestimate what they can change in 5 years. This asymmetry creates a particular kind of trap. You set an ambitious goal. You pursue it with intensity for a few weeks. You don't see the dramatic results you expected, and you conclude that change isn't working, that you're not capable of it, that the effort is worth it. And you stop, and then you try again in a few months with the same approach and the same result. What you're missing is the compound nature of genuine transformation. The changes that matter most in character, in capability, in the depth of your relationships, in the quality of your thinking, don't happen in visible leaps. They happen in increments so small that you often can't perceive them in real time. It's only when you look back across a significant span of time that you can see how far you've actually moved. And most people don't give themselves enough time to see that. They're evaluating a 5-year process on a 2-week timeline and concluding it doesn't work. The metaphor I find most accurate here is not a sprint or even a marathon. It's more like the growth of a forest. A forest doesn't grow quickly. The individual trees don't make dramatic daily progress that you can observe and measure. But over years and decades, the transformation is total. What was open ground becomes something dense and complex and alive, something that supports its own ecosystem, something that can weather storms that would destroy a single sapling. That's what genuine character development looks like. And it requires a relationship with time that most people in the modern world have not developed, a willingness to invest in processes whose returns are delayed, whose progress is invisible in the short term, and whose value is only fully apparent in retrospect. This is why the question of meaning matters so much practically, because meaning is what sustains effort across the time scale on which genuine change operates. If what you're doing is only valuable when it's producing visible results, you will stop when the results aren't visible, which is most of the time. But if what you're doing is connected to something you genuinely value, to a kind of person you genuinely want to be, then the absence of visible results doesn't stop you. You continue because the doing itself is an expression of who you are, not just an instrument for producing outcomes. And this brings me to what I think is the deepest insight in this entire conversation. The reason most people don't change is not that they lack information or willpower or opportunity. It's that they haven't yet really decided at the level of identity and values rather than at the level of desire and intention who they are going to be. They're still living in the subjunctive mood. I would like to be this kind of person. I hope to become this. I'm trying to change. But they haven't made the declarative commitment that genuine transformation requires. I'm becoming this person. This is who I am. My actions will reflect this, not because I feel like it today, but because I've decided it. That decision is not made once. It's remade every day in small moments that feel insignificant but are actually the substance of character. Every time you choose the difficult thing over the easy thing. Every time you tell the truth when a comfortable lie was available. Every time you keep a commitment to yourself when no one would notice if you didn't. Every time you treat your future self as someone worth sacrificing your present comfort for. These moments don't feel heroic. They rarely feel meaningful in real time. But they are the actual material from which a genuinely different life is constructed. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic transformations. The small, repeated, unglamorous choices that accumulate over time into a character that is capable of things the previous version of you could not have done. The people who change are not special. They're not more gifted or more fortunate or more motivated than you are. What they've done is something available to every person with the honesty to see themselves clearly, the courage to act on what they see, and the patience to trust a process whose results arrive slowly. The question is not whether you're capable of changing, almost certainly you are. The question is whether you're willing to pay the actual price, not the price you imagined, which was probably dramatic and temporary, but the real price, which is ordinary and ongoing. The price of being honest with yourself every day, the price of choosing your values over your comfort repeatedly without applause, the price of becoming slowly and unglamorously someone you actually respect. That price is real, but so is what it buys. And the thing it buys is not a perfect life, or a life without suffering, or a life that looks impressive from the outside. What it buys is something rarer and more durable than any of those things. It buys the experience of being someone who took their own life seriously enough to actually live it, who looked at the gap between who they were and who they could be and decided, with clear eyes and no guarantees, to close it. That's not a small thing. In fact, I'm not sure there's anything larger